It was a bright, sunny afternoon in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, a place where lawns were immaculately kept, and the sound of children playing echoed through the streets. But beneath the calm surface, a storm was about to brew, one that would change the lives of everyone involved. A well-dressed black man, exuding calm confidence, walked up the driveway of a modest home. In his hand, he carried a medical bag, the kind you'd expect from someone who had dedicated their life to helping others. He was here on a house call, an increasingly rare practice but one he felt passionate about. This wasn't just his job, it was his way of giving back to the community. Across the street, a middle-aged woman peered suspiciously from behind her curtains. Her lips pressed tightly together as she watched the man step onto the porch. Her thoughts raced. Who was he? What was he doing here? Her mind conjured assumptions that would soon spiral out of control. She grabbed her phone. Within seconds, she was on the line with the police. "Yes, there's a suspicious man on my neighbor's property," she said, her voice sharp with indignation. "He doesn't belong here. I think he might be trying to break in." The man knocked on the door, completely unaware that he was being watched or that he was already being judged. Moments later, the door opened, and an elderly woman greeted him warmly. They exchanged pleasantries, and he stepped inside. But to the woman across the street, this simple act only confirmed her suspicions. Minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the neighborhood's tranquility. Police cars screeched to a halt in front of the house, officers stepping out with authority. The man had just finished taking the elderly woman's blood pressure when the commotion outside caught his attention. Confused, he glanced through the window to see the flashing red and blue lights. The next few moments unfolded like something out of a movie. The officers knocked loudly on the door, their voices commanding. The man, calm but puzzled, opened it. What happened next would leave the entire neighborhood and soon, the internet completely stunned. This story is about more than just one afternoon in the suburbs. It's about assumptions, prejudice, and the power of grace under pressure. It's a story that challenges us to look at ourselves, our communities, and the way we treat one another. But most importantly, it's a story with an ending you'll never see coming. Stay tuned, because what happens next will not only shock you but may also restore your faith in the power of truth and justice. The man stood in the doorway, his calm expression hiding the mix of emotions brewing beneath the surface. The officers stood stiffly on the porch, their hands resting on their belts, eyes scanning him from head to toe as though searching for something out of place. Behind them, the nosy neighbor who had called them peeked out from the sidewalk, her phone in hand as if she were documenting her perceived heroism. "Sir, we got a call about a potential break-in," one officer said, his tone firm but neutral. "Can we see some ID?" The man blinked, momentarily stunned by the absurdity of the situation. "Break-in?" He gestured behind him toward the cozy living room where the elderly woman sat, her tea in hand, looking equally confused. "I'm Dr. Lawrence," he said evenly, his voice steady. "I'm here to check on my patient. She called me earlier this week for a follow-up." The officer's gaze flickered toward the older woman, who nodded vigorously from her armchair. "That's right. I called him," she said, her voice slightly shaky but insistent. "He's my doctor." Despite her confirmation, the tension didn't immediately dissolve. The other officer exchanged a glance with his partner, their postures still guarded. "Can we just verify that with some ID?" Dr. Lawrence reached into his pocket slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. He handed over his driver's license and medical credentials, keeping his hands visible at all times. He'd been through situations like this before. Too many times, if he was being honest. Meanwhile, the woman across the street continued to linger, her expression one of smug satisfaction. She muttered something under her breath, loud enough for the officers to hear. "I knew he didn't belong here. You can't be too careful these days." The comment hung in the air like a thick, unwelcome cloud. Dr. Lawrence's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, keeping his focus on the officers. One of them examined his ID carefully, comparing it to the man standing before him. Finally, he gave a small nod and handed it back. "Looks like everything checks out," the officer said, his tone softening slightly. "Sorry for the inconvenience, sir." "Inconvenience?" The elderly woman stood up, her frail frame trembling with anger. "This is outrageous. You come barging into my house because of some ridiculous phone call? Dr. Lawrence has been my doctor for years." Dr. Lawrence placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Mrs. Benton," he said gently. But his eyes betrayed his frustration, flicking briefly toward the woman across the street. She was still standing there, her arms folded, as if daring him to say something. The officers apologized again, this time to Mrs. Benton as well, before heading back to their patrol car. As they drove away, the tension in the air didn't dissipate. Dr. Lawrence could feel the weight of the woman's stare across the street, her judgment hanging over him like a dark shadow. "Thank you for handling that so calmly," Mrs. Benton said, her voice softening. She looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "I'm so sorry this happened to you. It's not right." Dr. Lawrence gave her a small smile, but his mind was racing. He'd grown used to moments like these, moments where his professionalism and credentials weren't enough to shield him from the assumptions others made. But this time felt different. This time, someone had actively tried to paint him as a threat. After finishing his visit and ensuring Mrs. Benton was comfortable, he stepped outside. The woman across the street was still there, now talking animatedly to another neighbor who had joined her on the sidewalk. Their voices were low, but their glances in his direction made it clear they were discussing him. Dr. Lawrence took a deep breath, his hands tightening into fists before he released them. He walked to his car, his movements measured, refusing to let their stares shake him. But as he pulled out of the driveway and drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. What he didn't know was that the nosy neighbor had already posted about the incident online, twisting the narrative to make herself look like a vigilant hero. Within hours, her posts began gaining traction, sparking heated debates in the comments. Some praised her for looking out for the neighborhood, while others called her out for her blatant bias. The story started to spread, shared by people who added their own opinions and embellishments. And as it grew, so did the stakes. Dr. Lawrence, unaware of the brewing storm on social media, returned to his office, determined to focus on his patients. But by the next morning, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Texts, emails, and missed calls poured in from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. "Have you seen this?" one text read, followed by a link. Dr. Lawrence clicked on it hesitantly. What he saw made his stomach drop. There, on a local community page, was a post accusing him of being suspicious and potentially dangerous. The woman had even included a blurry photo she'd taken from her window, showing him walking up to Mrs. Benton's house. The comments ranged from supportive to downright hateful. Some people defended him, pointing out the absurdity of the situation, while others doubled down, demanding to know why he was in the neighborhood in the first place. Dr. Lawrence sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. He knew he couldn't ignore this. Not this time. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. Reporters began reaching out, wanting to hear his side of the story. Activists picked up on the incident, using it as an example of the racial bias that still plagued society. And all the while, the woman across the street seemed oblivious to the impact of her actions. Dr. Lawrence had a choice to make. He could let the narrative continue to spiral out of control, or he could take a stand and share the truth. But as he prepared to speak out, he couldn't help but wonder, would people actually listen? And what would happen if they didn't? Over the next few days, the ripple effects of the incident spread further than Dr. Lawrence could have imagined. The post by the neighbor, whose name he still didn't know, had gone viral. It wasn't just the local community buzzing about it anymore, it had reached far beyond the suburban neighborhood, drawing the attention of social media users from across the country. Some online commenters were furious at what they saw as blatant prejudice. A black doctor, helping an elderly patient, and this is how he's treated? One person wrote. Disgusting. Others, however, took a different angle, repeating the baseless claims about Dr. Lawrence being out of place in the neighborhood. The discussions grew heated, with people throwing accusations back and forth, each comment adding fuel to an already raging fire. Dr. Lawrence tried to stay focused on his work. He saw patients, answered their questions with the same calm professionalism he was known for, and did his best to keep his personal life separate from the chaos online. But it wasn't easy. Everywhere he turned, someone was either asking him about the incident or offering unsolicited advice. "You need to sue her for defamation," a colleague told him over coffee one morning. "People like that need to be held accountable." "I think he should go on the news," said another. "Set the record straight." Dr. Lawrence appreciated their support, but he wasn't sure what the right move was. Part of him wanted to speak out, to defend himself against the lies and half-truths spreading like wildfire. But another part of him hesitated. What if speaking up only made things worse? What if it drew even more attention to the woman's narrative? Meanwhile, in the neighborhood, tensions were quietly simmering. Some residents had started to turn on the nosy neighbor, calling her out for what they saw as unnecessary and harmful behavior. Others rallied around her, insisting she had only been trying to protect the community. At the same time, whispers about Dr. Lawrence began to circulate. Most people knew him as a kind, dedicated doctor who had helped countless patients over the years. But a small, vocal group couldn't seem to let go of the idea that he didn't belong. One evening, as Dr. Lawrence drove home from his clinic, he noticed a group of reporters gathered near his office. Cameras flashed as they filmed segments for the evening news, their voices carrying through the night air. This story has sparked a national conversation about racial bias and the dangers of making assumptions, one reporter said into her microphone. Dr. Lawrence has not yet commented publicly, but his supporters say this incident is a stark reminder of the challenges faced by professionals of color, even in their own communities. Dr. Lawrence sighed, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. He had always tried to stay out of the spotlight, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But now, it seemed, the choice was no longer his to make. That night, as he sat in his quiet home, he received a phone call from an unexpected source, Mrs. Benton's grandson. "I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Lawrence," the young man said. His voice was warm but tinged with anger. "My grandmother told me everything. I can't believe someone would treat you like that, after all you've done for her. I want you to know our family is behind you 100%. Dr. Lawrence smiled, feeling a rare moment of relief. "Thank you? That means a lot." But the conversation wasn't over. Mrs. Benton's grandson hesitated before speaking again. "Actually, there's something else I wanted to tell you. I heard the woman who called the police is planning to hold a community meeting about neighborhood safety. It sounds like she's doubling down on this whole thing." Dr. Lawrence's stomach sank. A community meeting? What more could she possibly have to say? The following weekend, the meeting was held at the local community center. Dr. Lawrence debated whether or not to attend. Part of him wanted to stay away, to avoid giving the woman any more ammunition. But another part of him knew he couldn't let her continue spreading lies unchecked. When he arrived, the room was already packed. Residents sat in folding chairs, murmuring quietly among themselves. At the front of the room, the nosy neighbor stood with a clipboard, her expression smug. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying over the low hum of conversation. "I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about some recent incidents in our neighborhood and how we can work together to keep our community safe." She spoke for several minutes, painting herself as a concerned citizen who had only been trying to do the right thing. She didn't mention Dr. Lawrence by name, but her insinuations were clear. "I know some people think I overreacted," she said, her tone defensive. "But I stand by my actions. We can't afford to take chances when it comes to protecting our homes and families." Dr. Lawrence listened quietly, his jaw clenched. He could feel the eyes of several neighbors on him, some sympathetic, others unsure. Finally, he decided he'd had enough. He stood, the scrape of his chair against the floor cutting through the woman's speech. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I think it's time we addressed the real issue here." The nosy neighbor froze, her mouth slightly open as though she hadn't expected him to show up, let alone speak. Dr. Lawrence took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes could change everything for better or worse. The room was so quiet that every breath, every shift in a chair seemed deafening. Dr. Lawrence stood tall, his calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He glanced around, making eye contact with the faces in the crowd, some familiar, others not. Some looked supportive, while a few seemed skeptical, their arms crossed defensively as they waited to see what he would say. "First, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight," Dr. Lawrence began, his voice steady. "I think it's important that we talk about safety in our community. But I also think it's important that we talk about something else: assumptions." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, and the woman at the front shifted uncomfortably. She clutched her clipboard tighter, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I understand that we all want to feel safe where we live," Dr. Lawrence continued. "I get that. But when we start making assumptions about people based on how they look, or what we think we know about them, it can lead to dangerous situations. It can lead to harm. And that's exactly what happened last week." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room remained silent, the weight of his statement hanging in the air. "I was here," he said, his voice growing firmer, "in this neighborhood, because a patient of mine needed help. That's it. I wasn't breaking into a house, I wasn't causing trouble, I was doing my job. But instead of being seen as a doctor, as someone who was there to care for a member of this community, I was seen as a threat." The woman at the front took a small step forward, her face flushed. "I didn't mean," she started, but Dr. Lawrence raised a hand, cutting her off. "Please," he said, his tone still calm but resolute. "Let me finish." She hesitated, then stepped back, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "I've worked hard my entire life to get where I am," Dr. Lawrence continued. "I've dedicated years to helping people, to earning their trust. And yet, with one phone call, all of that was ignored. All that mattered was someone's assumption that I didn't belong here." A soft gasp came from the back of the room, where Mrs. Benton sat with her grandson. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her expression a mix of anger and sadness. Dr. Lawrence glanced toward her, then back to the crowd. "I know I'm not the only person this has happened to. And I know I won't be the last. But if we don't address this, if we don't have these uncomfortable conversations, nothing will change." He took a step closer to the front of the room, his gaze locking on the woman who had called the police. Her defiance from earlier was gone now, replaced by a flicker of something that looked almost like guilt. "I'm not here to attack anyone," Dr. Lawrence said, his voice softening slightly. "I'm here to ask for better. From all of us. Because if we can't trust one another, if we can't see each other as human beings first, then what kind of community are we really building?" The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. No one seemed to know what to say. Dr. Lawrence felt the weight of their stares, but he held his ground, his shoulders straight. Finally, Mrs. Benton's grandson stood up, his voice breaking the stillness. "Dr. Lawrence is right," he said. "We can't keep pretending this kind of thing doesn't happen. And we can't keep letting it slide when it does. It's not just about this one incident, it's about what it represents. More murmurs rippled through the crowd, louder this time. A few people nodded, their expressions thoughtful. Others still looked hesitant, unsure of where they stood. The woman at the front seemed to shrink under the weight of the room's attention. Her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with her clipboard, her earlier confidence nowhere to be found. I didn't mean to cause so much trouble, she mumbled, her voice barely audible. I thought I was doing the right thing. Dr. Lawrence took a deep breath, his eyes softening. I understand that. But the right thing isn't about acting on fear or assumptions. It's about asking questions, about giving people the benefit of the doubt. It's about seeing the person, not just the stereotype. For a moment, the woman didn't respond. She looked down at her clipboard, then back up at Dr. Lawrence. Her mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. The tension in the room was nearly unbearable now, the kind that makes every second feel like an eternity. It felt as though the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Dr. Lawrence glanced around the room one last time, his eyes meeting those of his neighbors. Some looked apologetic, others defiant, and a few seemed genuinely moved. He wasn't sure if his words had reached everyone, but he knew he'd done everything he could. As he stepped back, the woman at the front finally spoke, her voice trembling. I think we all need to reflect on what we've learned here tonight. Her words were cautious, almost rehearsed, but they carried a weight that suggested she was beginning to understand the gravity of her actions. The crowd murmured again, their voices a mix of agreement and uncertainty. Dr. Lawrence nodded, his heart still pounding as he sat down. The tension hadn't dissolved, it lingered in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and unresolved. But for the first time, it felt like there was a crack in the armor, a small glimmer of hope that things could change. The meeting wrapped up shortly after, with people filing out of the room in hushed groups. Some approached Dr. Lawrence to thank him, their voices warm and sincere. Others avoided his gaze, slipping out quietly as though hoping to avoid confrontation. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit him, a welcome relief from the suffocating tension of the meeting. He looked up at the stars, feeling both exhausted and strangely at peace. But deep down, he knew the story wasn't over yet. Something was still brewing, and the resolution, whatever it might be, was just around the corner. Dr. Lawrence stood outside the community center for a long moment, letting the cool air clear his thoughts. The meeting had gone better than he'd expected, but the unease in his chest refused to settle. As he walked to his car, he noticed a figure lingering by the edge of the parking lot. At first, he assumed it was just another neighbor heading home, but as he got closer, the figure stepped forward, and he realized it was Mrs. Benton's grandson. "Hey, Dr. Lawrence," the young man said, his voice low. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Dr. Lawrence stopped, curious but wary. "Of course. Is everything okay?" The young man glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure no one else was within earshot. "I wasn't going to bring this up, but I think you need to know. There's something strange going on with that woman Margaret, or whatever her name is." Dr. Lawrence raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I overheard her talking to someone before the meeting," he said. "She was on the phone, and she sounded panicked. She kept saying something about protecting herself, about how this whole thing was getting out of hand. But what really caught my attention was when she said your name. She said, if this keeps going, he's going to ruin me." Dr. Lawrence's pulse quickened. "Ruin her? What does that even mean?" The young man shook his head. "I don't know. But it sounded like she's hiding something. Like maybe this isn't just about her calling the police on you. Maybe there's more to it." Dr. Lawrence frowned, his mind racing. The idea that there could be another layer to all of this hadn't even crossed his mind. He'd assumed the woman's actions were rooted in ignorance or prejudice, but if she was worried about being exposed for something, what could it be? The young man hesitated before speaking again. Look, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but if I were you, I'd be careful. She seemed desperate. People do crazy things when they feel cornered. Dr. Lawrence nodded, his unease growing. Thanks for letting me know. I'll keep that in mind. As he drove home, the conversation replayed in his head. What could this woman possibly have to hide? And why would she think he had the power to ruin her? The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. But one thing was clear, this situation was far from over. The next morning, Dr. Lawrence woke to find his phone buzzing with notifications. At first, he thought it was just more fallout from the viral post, but when he opened his messages, he saw something that made his stomach drop. An anonymous email had been sent to his clinic's general inbox, and the subject line read, "You've been warned." The email itself was short but chilling, "Stay out of our business, or you'll regret it. This isn't your fight." Dr. Lawrence stared at the screen, his hands gripping his phone tightly. The message was vague, but the threat was clear. Someone didn't want him digging deeper, and they were willing to intimidate him to keep him quiet. He forwarded the email to his lawyer and the police, deciding it was better to be safe than sorry. But as the day went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every car that passed his clinic, every unfamiliar face in the waiting room set him on edge. Later that afternoon, a knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. It was one of his nurses, her expression concerned. "Dr. Lawrence, there's a man here asking for you," she said. "He says it's important." Dr. Lawrence frowned. "Did he say who he is?" She shook her head. "No, but he seems intense." Curious and cautious, Dr. Lawrence stepped into the lobby. A tall man in a dark suit was waiting for him, his posture stiff and formal. "Dr. Lawrence," the man said, extending a hand. "My name is Richard. I represent a private organization, and I believe we need to talk." Dr. Lawrence hesitated before shaking his hand. "What kind of organization?" Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say we have a vested interest in keeping certain matters under control. I'm here to offer you a friendly piece of advice. Let this situation with your neighbor go. It's not worth the trouble." Dr. Lawrence's jaw tightened. "And why is that?" Richard's smile faltered. "Because digging into this will only make things harder for you. Trust me, doctor, some things are better left alone." Dr. Lawrence met his gaze, refusing to back down. "I appreciate your concern, but I don't respond well to threats." Richard's expression hardened. "This isn't a threat. It's a warning. Walk away, and this all goes away. Keep pushing, and you'll regret it." With that, he turned and left, leaving Dr. Lawrence standing in the middle of the lobby, his mind racing. Whoever this man was, he clearly wasn't just some concerned neighbor. And whatever was going on, it was bigger than Dr. Lawrence had realized. As the day wore on, the pieces of the puzzle began to form a darker, more complicated picture. The neighbor's call to the police wasn't just a case of misplaced suspicion, it was part of something much larger, something that someone was desperate to keep hidden. Dr. Lawrence knew he was in deep now, but one thing was certain, he couldn't walk away. Not when the truth was so close, and not when so much was at stake. The stakes had never been higher, and as the sun set that evening, Dr. Lawrence realized he was heading straight into the eye of the storm. Whatever was coming next, he would have to face it head on. Dr. Lawrence spent the night piecing together everything that had happened over the past few days. The strange threats, the mysterious man, and Margaret's panicked phone call all pointed to something far more intricate than he'd imagined. It wasn't just about one mistaken phone call, it felt like there was a web of secrets tangled behind it, and he was at the center. But why? Determined to find answers, he decided to confront Margaret directly. Early the next morning, he drove to her house, his resolve steady despite the tension gnawing at his stomach. Her house stood at the corner of the street, quiet and unassuming, but now it felt like the epicenter of everything that had gone wrong. When he knocked on her door, there was no immediate response. He waited, hearing faint shuffling inside, before the door finally cracked open. Margaret peered out, her expression guarded. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than he expected. "We need to talk," Dr. Lawrence said firmly. "No games, no interruptions. I want the truth." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, then opened the door just wide enough for him to step inside. The tension in the air was palpable as she led him to the living room, where stacks of papers and files were scattered across the coffee table. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Margaret said, folding her arms defensively. "But this needs to stop." Dr. Lawrence gestured to the disarray around her. "Stop what?" "Trying to understand why someone who barely knows me is going to such lengths to make my life difficult. You don't trust me, fine. But there's something else going on here, and you owe me an explanation." Margaret's face flushed, and she began pacing the room. "You don't understand," she muttered. "This isn't about you. It never was." "Then what is it about?" Dr. Lawrence pressed. She stopped pacing, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally caught up to her. "You're right," she admitted quietly. "There's more to this. But if I tell you, I don't know what will happen to me, to this neighborhood, to everything." Dr. Lawrence's voice softened, though his determination didn't waver. "Whatever it is, keeping it hidden isn't helping anyone. You called the police on me because you were afraid, but it wasn't just fear of me, was it? You were trying to protect something." Margaret sighed, sitting down heavily on the couch. For a long moment, she said nothing, staring at her hands as if searching for the right words. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and fear. "There's a group in this neighborhood," she began. "They call themselves a community association, but they're more like enforcers. They keep everything running the way they want, and anyone who steps out of line is dealt with. When I moved here, I thought they were just nosy neighbors. But then I saw what they were capable of." Dr. Lawrence frowned. "Capable of what?" Margaret hesitated, her voice trembling as she continued. "They have dirt on everyone, financial records, personal secrets, things that could ruin people. They keep the peace by keeping everyone in check. And when I saw you that day, I panicked. I thought if I didn't act, they'd think I wasn't loyal. I didn't know they'd escalate things like this. I didn't know they'd drag you into it." Dr. Lawrence felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The threats, the man in the suit, even the cryptic email, it was all connected to this shadowy group operating in the neighborhood. "Who's in charge?" he asked, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his chest. Margaret shook her head. "I don't know exactly. They don't use names. But I know they're watching everything. The man who came to see you? He's one of them. And if they think you're a threat, they won't stop until they've silenced you." Dr. Lawrence's mind raced. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the entire community living under the thumb of an unseen force. And if Margaret was right, exposing the truth wouldn't just be dangerous, it could upend everything. Before he could respond, there was a loud knock at the door. Both of them froze, the sound cutting through the room like a knife. Margaret's face went pale as she whispered, "They're here." Dr. Lawrence motioned for her to stay back as he approached the door. When he opened it, he found Richard standing there again, his expression colder than before. "I warned you, Doctor," Richard said, his tone low and threatening. "You're playing a dangerous game." Dr. Lawrence didn't flinch. "And I'm not backing down." Richard's eyes narrowed, But before he could respond, Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Enough," she said. "You can't keep doing this. People are going to find out. He's going to find out." Richard's expression flickered, a brief moment of uncertainty crossing his face before he regained his composure. "Careful, Margaret," he said. "You know what's at stake." Dr. Lawrence stepped between them. "Whatever this is, it ends now," he said. "You can't threaten your way out of the truth." For the first time, Richard looked rattled. He glanced over his shoulder, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You don't understand what you're up against," he said. "This isn't just about you. There are bigger forces at play here, forces that won't hesitate to destroy you if you push too far." Dr. Lawrence held his ground, his resolve unshaken. "Let them try," he said. Richard stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the quiet street. As the door closed behind him, Margaret let out a shaky breath. "You don't know what you've just done," she said. Dr. Lawrence turned to her, his expression resolute. "No, but I'm going to find out. And I'm not stopping until this is over." The tension in the room was electric, the stakes higher than ever. The truth was closer than ever, but so was the danger, and Dr. Lawrence knew there was no turning back now. Dr. Lawrence stood in the quiet of Margaret's living room, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. Outside, the street looked peaceful and unassuming, but he now understood there was a hidden war brewing beneath the surface. This wasn't just about him, or even Margaret. It was about an entire community being controlled by fear, manipulation, and the secrets of a powerful group. He wasn't sure what his next step would be, but he knew he couldn't let things continue as they were. Margaret sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a mug of tea she hadn't even sipped. "You have no idea what they'll do now," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Once they see you won't back down, they'll escalate. They always do." Dr. Lawrence placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "If they wanted to scare me, they've already tried. But I won't be silent. I didn't go through years of training, fighting for respect as a doctor, just to back down because someone thinks they can control me or this neighborhood." Margaret looked at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. "But what if it's not just you they go after? They target people's families, their livelihoods. They ruin people." Dr. Lawrence thought of his patients, his colleagues, and the life he had built in this community. The idea of it all being torn apart was daunting, but so was the idea of living in a place ruled by fear. "Sometimes," he said, "the only way to stop a bully is to shine a light on what they're doing. They thrive in the shadows, but if we bring the truth out into the open, they lose their power." Margaret nodded slowly, though it was clear she remained terrified. "What are you going to do?" Dr. Lawrence didn't have a full plan yet, but he knew he couldn't face this alone. He decided to start with the community. If these enforcers relied on secrecy and division, then bringing people together might be the first step to dismantling their hold. The next day, he organized a meeting at the community center, inviting anyone who wanted to attend. He didn't explain everything in the flyer he distributed, only that it was about fostering a safer, stronger neighborhood. At first, he worried no one would show up, but as the time approached, people trickled in, curious and concerned. Among them were some familiar faces, neighbors who had supported him after the incident with the police, a few local business owners, and even Margaret, though she lingered nervously near the back of the room. Dr. Lawrence stood in front of them, his voice steady as he began to speak. "I moved to this neighborhood because I believed in its potential. I saw a community that could be a home not just for me, but for everyone who lives here. But over the past few weeks, I've realized there's something wrong. There's a fear that keeps people from truly connecting, from speaking up, from being themselves." The room was quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. Some of you may already know what I'm talking about. Others might not. But there's a group in this neighborhood that's been controlling things behind the scenes, spreading fear, silencing voices, and keeping us divided. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people exchanged uneasy glances, while others leaned forward, their interest piqued. Dr. Lawrence pressed on. We can't let this continue. We can't let fear dictate how we live our lives. But to stop it, we need to come together. We need to share what we know and support each other. At first, there was silence, the room heavy with uncertainty. Then, one by one, people began to speak up. A local shop owner recounted how she had been pressured to raise her prices to keep certain customers away. A young couple shared how they had been warned not to associate with certain neighbors. Even Margaret found her voice, admitting her role in calling the police on Dr. Lawrence and explaining the pressure she had been under. As the stories unfolded, a sense of solidarity began to take root. People realized they weren't alone, that the fear and control they had experienced were part of a larger pattern. Dr. Lawrence encouraged everyone to document their experiences, to create a record of what had happened. The more we know, the stronger we are, he said. And if we stand together, they can't silence us all. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The stories from the meeting were compiled into a detailed report, which Dr. Lawrence and a few trusted allies shared with local authorities and journalists. At first, there was resistance. Some dismissed the claims as exaggerations or misunderstandings. But as more people came forward, the evidence became undeniable. Richard and the so-called enforcers began to feel the pressure. Their influence started to crumble as their secrets were exposed. The community that had once been fractured by fear began to unite, supporting one another and refusing to be intimidated. Dr. Lawrence became a central figure in the movement, not because he sought the spotlight, but because his calm determination inspired others. One day, as he was leaving his clinic, he noticed Margaret waiting for him outside. She looked different, more confident, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. I wanted to thank you, she said, for not giving up. For helping me see that I didn't have to live in fear. Dr. Lawrence smiled. You're the one who made the choice to speak up. That took courage. Margaret nodded, a hint of a smile on her face. I'm starting to feel like maybe this neighborhood can be what it was meant to be, a real community. In the weeks that followed, the changes became even more evident. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before began organizing events and helping one another. The enforcers' grip on the neighborhood was broken, and the police began investigating their activities, uncovering a web of corruption that stretched far beyond the local level. But the most profound change was in the people themselves. They had faced their fears and come out stronger, realizing that unity and transparency were their greatest strengths. For Dr. Lawrence, it was a reminder of why he had chosen to live and work there in the first place. As he walked through the neighborhood one evening, the streets buzzing with life and laughter, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been difficult, and there were still challenges ahead, but the community had found its voice. And in doing so, they had created something truly remarkable, a place where everyone could belong. The story of what had happened became a lesson for others, spreading beyond the neighborhood as an example of how courage and unity could overcome even the most entrenched systems of fear and control. Dr. Lawrence knew the fight for justice and equality was ongoing, but for now, he allowed himself a moment to appreciate how far they had come.